Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Steve Grove, and I'm the head of news and politics at YouTube. And we're very lucky today to have Evgeny Morozov here with us. Evgeny just wrote a book, as you can see behind us, called The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom. And as we'll get into in just a moment, he holds a very interesting and I think useful perspective for people at Google to hear about what he might say are some of the myths or misunderstandings about technology and its role in politics. And so we're very excited to have him here today. This is part of both the YouTube News and Politics and Authors at Google NY event. Thanks to Kate up there for setting this up. I'm going to start by reading an excerpt from Evgeny's book. We reached out to Evgeny about 3 months ago to come to Google to speak, of course not knowing what would happen between the time we invited him and the time that he came. You can talk about WikiLeaks, you can talk about Tunisia, and you can talk even today about Egypt as being new data for us to explore and look at within the context of Evgeny's book. Good timing for you to be here. And we'll just do a little bit of Q&A up here between Evgeny and I, and then we'd love to just have a conversation with folks in the crowd. And I think we have a few people on VC as well. So I'm going to read an excerpt, and then we'll dive right in, Evgeny. This is from the first chapter of Evgeny's book, which is titled The Google Doctrine. And here's what he has to say. Iran's seemed like a revolution that the whole world was not just watching, but also blogging, tweeting, Googling, and YouTubing. It only took a few clicks to get bombarded by links that seemed to shed more light on events in Iran, quantitatively, if not qualitatively, than anything carried by what technologists like to condescendingly call the legacy media. Such virtual proximity to events in Tehran, abetted by access to the highly emotional photos and videos shot by protesters themselves, led to unprecedented levels of global empathy with the cause of the Green Movement. But in doing so, such networked intimacy may have also greatly inflated popular expectations of what it could actually achieve. As the Green Movement lost much of its momentum in the months following the election, it became clear that the Twitter revolution so many in the West were quick to inaugurate was nothing more than a wild fantasy. And yet it still can boast of at least one unambiguous accomplishment. If anything, Iran's Twitter revolution revealed the intense Western longing for a world where information technology is the liberator rather than the oppressor, a world where technology could be harvested to spread democracy around the globe rather than entrench existing autocracies. The irrational exuberance that marked the Western interpretation of what was happening in Iran suggests that the green-clad youngsters tweeting in the name of freedom nicely fit into some pre-existing mental schema that left little room for nuanced interpretation, let alone skepticism about the actual role the internet played at the time. So, Evgeny, tell us a little bit about what the Google Doctrine is and why you think it's irrationally exuberant.
Sure. Well, I was not referring to the doctrine when I said
right,
it was. But I mean, the idea of the Google Doctrine, I think, to me, it's just a useful moniker to describe. I think the somewhat dubious relationship that has now emerged between the State Department and people in Washington thinking about issues like internet freedom and Silicon Valley and firms like Google, like Facebook, like Twitter. I did not mean to zoom in on Google in particular. I think there is this expectation that since so much of this infrastructure that is now used by digital activists all over the world is built by American companies, that infrastructure somehow needs to be promoted by American politicians. And I think, again, we can debate the extent to which this is a useful policy orientation for people in Washington. I think there is certainly a danger here because there is disassociation between the kind of business interests and the business agenda of Silicon Valley and the political agenda of Washington. I think it may potentially harm both, for various reasons, which we can get into.
Well, so what is it? Why do you think people get so excited about the Twitter revolution in Iran or WikiLeaks, and why do you think that excitement is overstated or overfelt?
Sure. I mean, in the case of Iran, I think we have to understand that, again, the events in Iran are different from events in Tunisia, and they are different from events in Egypt. If you look at the media reaction to what was happening in Iran 18 months ago. I think that reaction, I think that focus on the role of technology much more than on the actual political factors that were driving the events and that were driving the protesters. And I think it created this very unhealthy myth that somehow all of those protests were organized and mobilized by Twitter. And I looked at the actual data from Iran. The only entity which actually fact-checked the number of Twitterers, if you will, in the country at the moment was Al Jazeera, and they could only find 60 people actively tweeting from Iran. Right? So the majority of them were not in Iran. Those were Iranian Americans tweeting probably from abroad. Again, they did play a role in terms of publicizing what happened, in terms of getting the story on the on the radar of the mainstream media, and especially of CNN, which did not cover the protests for the first few days. But I think if you go and trace and I do that in the first chapter, if you go and trace the kind of claims that were made about the power of technology back in Iran, I think most people did think that that was the end of the regime, and it came in part because so many people were armed with tweets and pokes and other forms and text messages. And of course, what happened afterwards, I think, got completely lost in the media coverage. And what happened is that since the government managed to stay in power, they actually turned to social media. They turned to the information posted to Facebook and Twitter. They even looked at mailing lists, basically, and email groups to identify some of the dissidents, to identify some of the protesters. They turned to Flickr, actually, to fetch some of the photos that were posted there by the participants themselves. And they circled some of the faces of protesters that they didn't know in red, and they posted them on government-run news media websites, asking people to identify people whom they could recognize. In a sense, they were crowdsourcing the gathering of information about the protesters, which was later used in court. That part of the story did not get almost any coverage in the media in the West, in part because I think it also reveals a somewhat ugly side to technology and to social media in general.
So the net effect of social media in Iran would be negative.
I wouldn't go that far, to say that it was negative. Again, it did not help the protesters to an extent that many people in the West thought that it did. It certainly put many of them at greater risk, I think, without them realizing and recognizing the kind of risks that they were taking. Again, my fear is that most of the people who are actively, tweeting and retweeting something, or were posting messages on Facebook, may not even have been aware that, the government has the technology to go track them down. And I'm not even talking about deep packet inspection technology, which supposedly was also used in Iran to look at the traffic. I'm talking about very basic stuff, looking at, social media sites. I just didn't know what we gained by saying whether it was positive or negative. It just didn't play that much of a role in Iran in getting people out into the streets. I think, to me, the most interesting part about what happened in Iran was the kind of media and public reaction that it produced. And I think it did reveal a lot about how we think about the liberating power of technology. So to me, the most interesting part was the public discourse in the West about what was happening in Iran, not necessarily the way in which it was used in Iran.
It's interesting you say that, because there was headline after headline after headline calling this a Twitter revolution or the YouTube revolution or whatever it might be. And of course, the native video played a lot into that, I think, in terms of people having this galvanizing thing that they could point to. Why, in your mind, as you researched in the book, that whole phenomenon, why are those of us in the West or in America, why were we so prone, if in fact there is a net delusion, it's a delusional viewpoint, why are we so prone to have it? Why was everyone so excited about technology if in fact there was only 60 people twittering from inside Iran, and the net effect was difficult for many activists?
Well, some of it, I think, has roots in just how we think about the liberating power of technology, not just the internet. Again, I have an entire chapter in the book looking at the kind of intellectual assumptions that so many pundits in America made about the power that technology played in supposedly ending the Soviet Union. There is a very rich tradition of journalists and politicians in this country claiming that it was first of all, it was Ronald Reagan who ended the Soviet Union, but second, it was the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and the Western broadcasts, and then the fax machines and the Xerox machines that were smuggled into the Soviet Union to be used by dissidents that eventually caused the Soviet system to collapse. I mean, you look at some of the columns written recently, even about Tunisia and Egypt, you still see a lot of columnists making that particular point, that it was the free flow of information that undermined the Soviet Union. And I think, there is definitely a role that, Western broadcasting certainly didn't hurt the chances of democratization in the Soviet Union, right? The samizdat literature certainly helped to create and shape the culture of resistance in the country. It was not the driving force by any means, and most historians now would probably credit the role of the economy and the fact that the Warsaw Pact could not compete with NATO. I mean, there are all sorts of structural factors which caused the Soviet Union to collapse. But however, it's just, as a narrative, it just makes for such better, copy in journalism to credit the role of the dissident with a fax machine than, some trade statistic and, in the Soviet economy. But of course, we end up with many of the stories glorifying the role of the user, glorifying the role of, the dissident. And I think many of the same assumptions now are being rediscovered when we talk about the power of blogging and the power of the internet. I mean, I spent some time analyzing Hillary Clinton's big speech last year on internet freedom.
On 21st century statecraft.
Well, I mean, technically it was a speech on internet freedom, and she did another speech on 21st century statecraft, but it was the museum speech on January 21st. And you look at that speech, and the way she describes all of the problems ahead in terms of internet freedom are all framed and phrased in terms of the Cold War vocabulary. It's all about the information curtain that's descending upon the world. It's all about virtual walls that are replacing the Berlin Wall. It's all about bloggers being dissidents 2.0 who are engaging in basically production of samizdat, which, again, she takes to mean basically blogging and tweeting and all of that. And I think, some of this is useful in terms of elevating the subject to, in terms of sort of institutional politics in the State Department. If you label bloggers as dissidents, probably anyone working in internet freedom will automatically get more traction, and it just will be much easier for them to get things done. But on the other hand, I'm just not sure that claiming that bloggers are dissidents is helpful in terms of grasping the actual environment in countries like Russia or countries like China or even Iran. We do have a lot of bloggers who are actually much more conservative than their leaders. There are plenty of bloggers in Iran who hate Ahmadinejad because he's not harsh enough.
So in some ways, you're taking contention with the sort of valuating technology is inherently good in some ways, whereas...
Yeah. Yes, but also evaluating, bloggers and blogging as just a logical continuation of those older processes of, samizdat, printing samizdat or distributing banned literature. Again, it's useful to an extent, but you have to realize that many of these countries have changed so tremendously. Russia and China and even Iran have changed a lot since 1989. It's no longer just a battle of, the bad guys who are in the government and the good guys who are opposing the government. They have much more complex political and social forces out there. In Russia, it's the nationalists who make the best use of technology, whether it's YouTube or whether it's blogging or whether it's tweeting. They are much better at organizing, getting people into the streets and having, race riots, as we saw in November in Moscow, for example, right? And if you just imagine that all of those internet users in Russia who are using these channels and platforms are dissidents, you're just missing out that many of them aren't, and many of them have agendas which probably look even more anti-democratic than, the Kremlin's one.
We should back up for a second and tell people in the room about your own story. You're from Belarus.
Yes.
You didn't start out with this opinion necessarily, but
No.
but this was sort of a conclusion that came to you after some thinking.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about how you
Sure.
came to write the
Sure.
book
So I come from Belarus, which, as some of you may know, is not probably the most democratic country in Eastern or Central Europe. So I've always been fascinated by the questions of basically democratization and how do you actually promote democracy in a country like Belarus without necessarily, having to send in the Marines or anything of that sort. So I've always been interested in sort of finding some softer models in which to open up the country and to promote democratic values. So I did get very excited about the power of technology and Web 2.0 around the year, I would say 2005 or so, when there was still a lot of excitement in the US about the power of new media. Remember it was, shortly after the 2004 presidential campaign, where there was still a lot of talk of Howard Dean making this excellent use
So you went into
new
thinking
media. So, I thought, gee, great, let's just use all of that. Let's use blogs and social networks and on all of those new platforms to basically push against the government. So I joined an NGO called Transitions Online, which was based in, and still is based in Prague, which was not only active in Belarus, they were acting throughout the former Soviet bloc, some like 29 countries, including, Central Eastern Europe, including places like Mongolia even. I eventually became the director of new media, which meant that I traveled throughout that region, gave trainings to a lot of bloggers and journalists and activists on how to use blogs and social networks to push for democratic change, but also oversaw a lot of projects that we got funded to do by the likes of, National Endowment for Democracy in Washington or all sorts of other funders that traditionally take government funding or,
And so you're out there
funding.
training bloggers and dissidents.
And supervising some, concrete projects.
And what were you
had,
learning?
Yeah.
Were they?
Well, for them it was easy. They wanted to promote their stuff. They wanted to mobilize people. They needed to know how to push their ideas out there. I ended up in Tajikistan in a training where, I brought this fancy PowerPoint, was, Flickr, YouTube, all the goodies of Web 2.0, and ended up in a room of people whose only experience with the web was basic chatting. They were still using all that chat software from the 90s, and they were operating in an environment where the only national paper comes out once a week on a Thursday, and it has no photos in it, just text. It was very hard to talk about the benefits of Web 2.0 activism, to that audience. But, in other cases, it was much better received because there were uses. The problem is that, as I discovered after 3 years of doing this, is that the governments themselves were becoming much more strategic about the use of the web. It was not just about blunt internet filtering. They were doing much more. They were not only banning access to certain URLs, they were beginning to pay bloggers to spread their own opinions and propaganda. They were beginning to turn to all sorts of data mining firms to learn about trends of, sentiment analysis on social media, understanding sort of what people think and how they behave and where things are happening. Even in Russia, you saw, pro-Kremlin oligarchs suddenly buying, new media platforms. You had, LiveJournal was bought by a Russian guy, basically, and now is owned by Russians, right? So all of those seemed kind of, at first they seemed very interesting. The other side, the enemy, was doing something as well. But, by 2007, I think, early 2008, I just realized that we were kind of losing the fight. And that, in addition to that, many of the projects that were funded by American donors in countries like Belarus or Central Asia actually had the opposite effect, because what happened is that you had this big foreign funder come in and hire all the most talented new media entrepreneurs and put them on grant money and and basically kill all local innovation, because now they didn't want to build a website unless they got a big grant. And once they got the grant, they would make sure that it fails because they can get another grant to fix all the problems, right? So you ended up in this cycle where all of the best people who could be working on all these wonderful projects ended up, working with NGOs that were just taking money from the West and not contributing much.
So, if the web is a platform on which any
Yes.
number of things can happen, good, bad, ugly, oppressive, democratic, revolutionary, there's a lot of things that can take place on the internet. What your book seems to be saying is, hey, wake up! Don't just concentrate on the good stuff. There's a lot of, there's a lot of there are a lot of challenges to the web in politics.
Yeah.
But that's just my sense of it. Why did you write the book? What do you hope someone gets out of your argument?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the primary interest, of course, is still policymakers. It's people. It's not the general kind of internet sort of media, new media public. To me, the primary market for that book is Washington, or London or Brussels. It's people who are thinking about ways in which to integrate new media and in which to integrate the internet into their existing sort of kind of foreign policy making apparatus, if you wish. And the problem is that, when I look at a concept like internet freedom, which Hillary Clinton, began to promote last year, I just think, if I have to evaluate it as a new, pillar of U.S. foreign policy, as she claimed it was, I think it's just a very weak concept. Not only does it not capture the kind of the darker side of what's happening in terms of these authoritarian governments themselves very actively using the web, I think it's also deaf to domestic policy and to what's sort of the U.S. government itself has been trying to do with the internet domestically in the last 3 or 4 years. If you look at the evolution of U.S. domestic American approach to the internet, I would argue it has all been about greater internet control, not greater internet freedom. Whether it's a matter of FBI and NSA trying to convince American companies to build backdoors into the system, whether it's going about domain names of people spreading pirated materials online, or whether it's a matter of going after companies that assist WikiLeaks. I mean, you look at all of that, and it makes America look extremely hypocritical when on the one hand they are touting the virtue of internet freedom abroad while kind of doing the exact opposite domestically. Right? So to me, we can debate how to resolve these problems domestically, but to me, the fact that now we have rushed into this quest of promoting internet freedom without having thought about how the State Department should structure its relationship with American companies, how they should structure their conversations with other agencies of the U.S. government, which are trying to do the opposite. What they're doing, I mean, all of those, I think, are big questions that need to be addressed, because it's very easy, I think, and I think that's in part what has been happening. It's very easy to be moving in the wrong direction at the great speed, right? And I think
what is wrong with the U.S. foreign policy's relationship with American technology companies, or their understanding of because access to information or internet freedom, could be applied to Radio Free Europe 20 years ago. I mean, that's a value that is.
But I mean, to me, the question is: do you, as Google, or does Facebook or Twitter want to be seen necessarily in Russia or China or Iran as the voice of America or Radio Free Europe? Right?
Again, very different in this context than.
I know, but still, I think it's a big question, because this is how you would be seen increasingly, right? And I just don't know whether it's a good idea to trust you to be Voice of America, because you're driven by a completely different set of motivations and incentives, right? So this is one problem that I see. The second problem is that, look at what happened in the last 2 years in terms of sort of what the State Department has been doing with American companies. I mean, you all know probably very well about the idea of technology delegations. You take the CEOs of American companies, send them abroad. Again, there was a dinner in which Hillary Clinton hosted for some of the CEOs at the State Department. Again, the question there is, why should, to me the question is, for example, why should the CEO of Twitter or the founder of Twitter be invited to the State Department when Twitter did not join the Global Network Initiative? A very simple question: why should the State Department be kind of promoting some of those very companies that do not want to sign up to certain standards of behavior, which the State Department
And
itself
just
is kind of championing. Right?
Explain the GNI for those here who
Yeah,
don't
I
know
mean,
what it is.
it's basically an industry-wide agreement of technology companies, certain NGOs, which Google is a member of, which specifies how they should behave when it comes to certain aspects of freedom of expression, how they should, treat
Right.
users and user data, and how they should interact with governments.
Right. So in some ways, it sounds like one of your concerns is private companies playing a very private companies whose platforms are made for profit because they're private companies being sort of used and at the forefront of public and international
Yes,
discussions.
but also, I just don't see how exactly, there is no firm approach. There is no coherent approach. I mean, you have, on the one hand, the State Department accusing or, being very critical of Cisco's role in providing technology to China, which facilitates their censorship. And then, on the other hand, a month ago, giving Cisco an innovation award. And it's very hard, again, to reconcile those two, even though, it may have been done by two different departments, two different bureaus within the State Department. But the other thing I think, you have to remember that if you look at the kind of perception that the State Department has created in terms of how it views American companies, it's not a very healthy perception. And here I have to speak critically of your new colleague now, Jared Cohen, who used to work at the State Department. Again, you look and track some of Jared's statements, where he would say things like, I'm quoting, "Facebook is the most organic tool for democracy promotion the world has ever seen." I mean, when you say things like that, when you work for the government, chances are, and when a lot of governments are concerned with America promoting democracy in their backyard, chances are it's not going to help either the government or Facebook, because the governments will try to squeeze out American companies or try to replace their services with local, more pliable and easier to control alternatives. Right?
So
when,
let's back up
yeah.
for a second and look at sort of how this relates to Google, because you're at Google, and love
Yes.
to dig a little bit more deeply into that. Our mission, as you know, is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And I think most people at Google don't think about that as like a business strategy, but just like a true good, right? Like more information is better for the world, and having more transparency and more access to it is good for our users and good for our citizens. Do you agree with that? I mean, would you take intention with that as a truth? And what problems or challenges do you see with it, and what would you hope Googlers know about your feeling on that question?
But I think it doesn't really matter whether I agree with that. The question is, how will that mission be perceived abroad by certain governments, and how will that mission be interpreted in light of certain events or relationships that Google has or does not have with the U.S. government? Because again, you look at Tunisia and Egypt, those countries have enjoyed American support, so no one would actually, no one inside would think that the protests there were actually organized by, the CIA. That would not seem like a realistic hypothesis. In the case of Iran or China or Belarus or many other countries, that would seem like a realistic hypothesis. So when some protests break out, the initial assumption is that, hey, they must have been orchestrated by America, by the State Department, training young activists, abroad, or training bloggers, or training cyber activists, you name it. And this is where I think you have to understand how, your own image will be perceived. I mean, it will not be, you will not be judged against your mission. You will be judged against your existing relationships, whether those are with the State Department or with the U.S. government, or with dissidents or with activists, right? And again, I'm not sure that this realization is. I mean, I'm sure it's there. I'm just not sure how how acutely aware you are of that.
You mentioned Tunisia and Egypt, and I would love to hear just your thoughts on the events of the past few months and how it relates to the project of this book.
Yeah. I mean, in some sense, if you look at the sort of public reaction to what happened, particularly in Tunisia, I think there was still quite a bit of hype in terms of people calling it the WikiLeaks revolution or a Twitter revolution. So I mean, in some sense, if you look at the public discourse, I mean, it has improved somewhat. I think people were much more reluctant to call it, a Twitter revolution as they were in Iran. But some of that was still there. In terms of the use of new media for organizing, I never denied that it would be used, right? And again, when the right time comes, it can do wonders. It helps to have not just Twitter but army on your side, and if you do, of course, social media will be a great role in terms of publicizing protests. The problem is that, if the government doesn't fall, then you end up in a situation like Iran, where the government also turns to the same platforms to basically make its crackdown much harsher because it has access to all the data, right? So again, it's all about political and social conditions on the ground, and not so much about technology. And I think we have to remember that. In Egypt, I think the situation is more or less similar. Many of these groups were in place, 3 years ago. Many of them, Facebook groups especially, many of them did not appear overnight, and many of these, digital networks have been in place for some time already. Again, the reason why I think they played such a big role in terms of publicizing the protests before the internet was cut off, again, was because the political situation was right, and the 30 years of Mubarak's rule were bound to end sooner or later. So again, I think it will be a mistake to attribute what has happened there to technology, because it's not driven by technology. And to me, the question is, in an age where everyone is on Facebook and Twitter and is using Google, how do we expect the revolution to look like? It's normal that all of them will have some
But is there something more inherently personal about these things that unfold when there's a way to connect to them through social media? To watch Neda pass away in the streets of Tehran as an American sitting at your laptop at your home is a very personal and chilling moment that I think probably connects people in a more deep way to an event than, say, seeing a Newswire story or... And so, whether or not the regime toppled, there's more people in the U.S. probably that feel a connection to what took place in Iran, I would argue, because of that connection, and in the long term, is that a good thing?
Well, again, the question is, to what extent will that influence U.S. foreign policy? You may argue that, there will be cases where, and now we're seeing a lot of images from Egypt, which probably make a lot of Americans feel that they need to push their government to change the policy on Egypt. I'm also sure that there will be cases where similar images will push America to change its foreign policy in ways that will not be necessarily conducive to democracy and democratization. The example I usually give is the photos that came out of Somalia, of U.S. soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. Again, that was very emotional. It led to America withdrawing its troops, in part because the U.S. public was so concerned and it wanted to exert pressure, right? So again, it all depends on, I think, the particular case. I wouldn't go as far as to say that the fact that so many Americans get so emotional about stuff online necessarily has a good influence on policymaking. No, I wouldn't. In part because it in some sense, it shortens the distance between the policymaker and the citizen. And at which point we really have to debate the virtues of direct democracy versus representative democracy. How much autonomy you actually want to grant your policymakers. And on many issues, I think we want to make sure that they are transparent, and this is why we have WikiLeaks. But on the other hand, I don't want policymakers, to set policy based on how many views each video gets on YouTube.
I don't think that's happening. It'd be interesting if that was the case. Charlie the Unicorn would be president of the United States. I'd like to open up for questions. If you have questions for Evgeny, there's mics here and here, and I don't know if anybody in the VC has one, but feel free to chime in if you do. Over here, sir.
Yeah. Events teach us many things. You mentioned Neda dying. It teaches us, on the one hand, it inspires us to see that other people potentially dying for freedom, perhaps set an example. On the other hand, it teaches us that running around the streets of a place like Iran during this sort of event is a really dangerous thing to do, and it may be considered unwise. There's a good side to that. There's a bad side. And the two sides are in anything. As far as sort of the argument that seems to be made here, it seems to me that a fundamental promise of democracy is that the voice of the people will be heard, that their experience and knowledge will be respected, and that it will be considered useful. And thus, for us to have a democracy, we have to have ways for people to be heard. We have to have ways to store and retrieve information. So it seems to me that sort of a society or a people's ability to either maintain a democratic form of government or to create one if it doesn't exist is fundamentally tied to the facility with which the technology that's available to them for sharing information, for communicating with others, for storing it, retrieving it, and the rest. Given that, it would seem to me that the internet, the technologies that we work on, et cetera, we must have them, and we probably must have more of them, of that technology and better technology, if we want to see democracy in the future. It may be that there's some unfortunate consequences along the way, but no matter how much sort of unfortunate consequences there may be, I think we need to accept that doing more with this technology is absolutely necessary. And that we should never hold back of building tools that make it easier for people to communicate, store information, exchange.
I mean, I think it's the right direction to think about it. The question is really, I mean, it's nice to be building tools, right? And it's nice to be building tools that circumvent censorship. The question, and it's nice for a company to be doing that, and I think Google is doing a great job. The question is, if you sit at an entity like the State Department, right, which has to make decisions about the allocation of resources, do you want to pour more money into building tools? Do you want to pour more money into training bloggers? Do you want to pour more money into, making sure that existing NGOs and political parties in a country like Belarus or Azerbaijan or whatever know about new media, right? And this is, I think, the question. I mean, there are different levels in which we have to answer this question. As a private actor, sure, you have to be doing as much as you can, probably on an issue in which you can contribute the most. It still doesn't answer how you should go and redistribute the resources within, the State Department or a government entity, which has to set policy based on what?
If we want democracy in Belarus.
Yes.
And if democracy relies on the ability of the people to communicate, store, et cetera, then how could we do anything other than work constantly to increase the facility with which the people can speak among themselves?
Well, I mean, there is no internet filtering in Belarus right now, right? Okay. So, but again, I think there is this very unhealthy tendency to think that once we build the tools and once people can bypass censorship, they will immediately, do certain things, X, Y, Z. And it just doesn't work that way. And again, from the perspective of someone who wants to spend a pot of money, $10 million or $1 million on fostering democratic change in a country like Belarus, I'm not sure that building tools is the way to go. Maybe you want to go and, make sure that your network of activists on the ground knows about how to campaign, how to resist police pressure, how to raise money. I mean, there are all sorts of other ways, which, by the way, we knew before the internet in terms of how to promote democracy elsewhere. So I mean, I understand the push
to campaign, to raise money, to do these things.
Yes.
These are all acts that require technology. Okay. The problem here is that the technology, the capacity to communicate, to store and retrieve, this is a fundamental requirement before any of these other things can occur. If you wish democracy, you must have these things. So to question whether or not
but if you don't have the network, if you don't have the
them,
networks of people who take advantage of these tools, there is no point in building the tools.
Yes, there is, because once you build the tools, once you provide the capabilities, they will be there for the people to use when they get in the mood to use them.
Well, I mean, I wish it was that simple, but again...
How could it be anything else?
Well, because there are elections in which, you need to have to make sure that you have political infrastructure, that you have political parties that can go and, and make sure that there are people after the elections to show up on the street. I mean, the tools will not get you 5,000 people to show up in a post-election protest as much as you want.
Okay, whatever. Information technology is the fundamental infrastructure for democracy. You cannot have one without the other.
No one is arguing that. You have to think about this from the perspective of a policymaker who has limited resources to spend on achieving a certain objective, right? Then let's just scrap the State Department and National Endowment for Democracy and just, empower Google to build tools and then wait until democracy happens.
So in some ways, you're just saying, hey, it's more complex than that.
Well, yes, again.
That's the crux of your argument in some ways.
Yes, but I don't even think I have to make that argument. Yes, of course it's more complex than that. But again, I just don't think that by building tools, necessarily you'll be getting any closer to any of those objectives. If you look at what it took to get the Ukrainians to the level of, the Orange Revolution, it took years of funding, years of hard work, years of training to their activists, years of making sure that the Ukrainian activists on the ground can, go and learn from the activists in Serbia who had a similar event, in Georgia who had similar events a few years before that. It didn't take, SMS technology to, text people and tell them what the protest is. That was the easiest part of the entire, So again, I'm all for building the infrastructure, just that as a policymaker, you probably want to have some kind of a framework where you know how to discriminate between great tools and great people and great networks.
Right. Let's go over here.
In light of Iran and Moldova, with very strong states that crush these new media revolutions, and I would argue in Egypt, where if the army were called in to actually crush this, they actually would be able to. Where do you see the value in social media, and where are the opportunities in what types of states and situations and socio-political situations where the new media actually has the greatest chance to affect democratic change?
Again, publicizing these events, I think, let's look at Egypt. I'm not sure that the reason why the Egyptians blocked the internet was to prevent Egyptians from organizing. It was probably to stop the photos and videos from getting out. That's the reason why they're now cracking down on Al Jazeera, right? Again, as Egyptians have shown, you don't really need a great social networking infrastructure to have so many people in the streets of Cairo, as they proved again just a few days ago. So I think there is definitely an element of making the violence more transparent, and this is what scares so many people in the government. In terms of the kind of positive program for social networking, I think, again, often there is an assumption that's made that, we don't need to have existing political movements. We don't need to build political parties. We don't need NGOs. The moment young people are online, they will all form their own groups on Facebook, and they will all pour into the streets and protest. In some case, probably something like that happened in Tunisia and Egypt, but I think we'll be oversimplifying that to claim that we can expect the same outcomes to come in, to happen in Russia or Belarus or Azerbaijan. And to me, the key question is, how can you actually make sure that these young digital gurus who are online and who are on Facebook do not disengage from the existing political forces on the ground? Because to me, the risk and the danger is that we'll see a growing disconnect between this younger generation who are on Facebook, who are online, and the older ones, which are eager to go online and protest and get beaten up and end up in jail, right? And I think, looking at my own country, to Belarus, I do see a lot of young people for whom virtual protest has become the kind of end in itself. They have so much fun.
Slacktivism, as they call it.
Yes, they have so much fun taking a photo of, the president and, photoshopping it and drawing all sorts of, mustache or whatever to the photo, and then claiming that it's a political act, and then, having a competition and thinking that it's the greatest act of dissent that they ever could, make. And I think this is the kind of activism and slacktivism I worry about, right? Again, in Tunisia, of course, there are a lot of people who are unemployed. There are a lot of young people who are overeducated and unemployed, which of course makes it easier for them to go out and mobilize. Kind of like Russia, the problems are different. And the unemployment is not there to the same extent, and the oil prices are, keeping the Russian economy afloat. So I think making sure that we don't just create virtual movements that exist on their own and make sure that we integrate them with existing ones would be a good way for social media to kind of advance.
Great. Let's go here.
We've been talking a lot about democracy, but I think even more important than that is liberty. And if you're not, it seems to me that if you're not careful, you get the kind of things like where in Algeria we had a movement for freedom, and then it became a repressive government. And as you mentioned, the nationalists in Russia. How do you keep things from just being a majority population stomping on the minority? Because it's easier to organize people around the things they hate than about things they love.
Well, I mean, I don't think that there is a way. I mean, you take the risk and see what happens. I would probably rather run the risk of having nationalists in power in Russia than see Kremlin continuously in charge, right? So, I don't know that there is a solution. Again, you have the same problem in the U.S., with the Tea Party exploiting social media very actively and aggressively for their own purposes, right? So I just don't think that there is an easy answer. I mean, just get people online and see what happens. My point, the reason why I talk about nationalists and all of those other forces that are not particularly, pro-democratic in the book is because the current internet freedom policy or internet freedom agenda is just completely deaf to the fact that some wrong forces may be empowered and that they will need to be somehow countered online. Right? You have in Russia, for example, you have nationalists who actually taking census data, which is now also available online, and they're taking the maps published not by Google but by Yandex in Russia, and they're creating mashups where they take census data about where national minorities live in a particular Russian town, and they mash it up with the map, and they basically show where minorities live in a particular Russian town, encouraging their supporters to go and basically, beat up anyone who lives in that part of the city. Right? Again, so. I don't know what you do about them, but I know that you need to have a somewhat more sophisticated view, probably driven by people and shaped by people who know something about Russia. The problem with the internet freedom agenda in the State Department right now is that it's all more or less articulated by people who seem to know so much about the internet, but very little about the regional environments, and very little about the politics of Russia, and very little about the politics of China or Iran. And that's why you run into all of those, geopolitical traps with, the government of Iran or China thinking that it was all about Twitter and it's the company, it was America's role, it was America's fault, that the protests happened. So part of the argument I'm making in the book is that the only way to reveal these traps is to empower people with regional expertise. It's not to empower internet gurus. It's not to empower people who know everything about Silicon Valley and Web 2.0, because there is a limit as to how much you can understand about the internet's impact on social change and political change if all you know is how the internet works. You do need to know about the social and political dynamics of these countries.
Let's go over here.
I think the number you threw out before about the 60 bloggers in Iran, it's a little misleading because I think the reach is more important rather than the actual bloggers. If everyone is, and then also I think you're always going to see with something good that comes out, you're going to see, such as with Iran, and you saw the oppressive government using these technologies in a negative way. You're always going to see that, but I don't think that's an argument to not develop these and promote these technologies.
Exactly. Yes. I'm not saying that we should just, shut down the internet and go back to the kind of pre-digital stage. To me, the bigger question is how do you get the policy right? Again, as I've said, and I do think that there are better and worse ways of going around setting policy, on internet freedom and on such issues. So, again, I think the reason why we need to look at the dark side, in part because we need to know who facilitates the dark side, right? Who makes it easier for the governments. Now in Belarus, for example, where I come from, we had protests in December after the presidential elections, just months ago. Now there are reports that the government is actually turning to mobile phone networks, to the operators of the mobile phones, basically, and demanding that they submit any data and any information about their users who may have shown up on the square, at that time, so that the government can actually go and track down all the dissidents who wanted to oppose it, who wanted to protest against it, And again, I don't know what kind of technology makes it possible. It may be that, any mobile phone company that has towers would be able to identify who those people are. But then they also want, these companies to provide the transcripts of some conversations and text messages traffic, and that technology was probably sold to those companies by Ericsson, just like we saw in the case of Iran with the technology sold to them by Nokia Siemens, also being exploited by the government. I don't know whether it was for deep packet inspection or it was for just tracing the mobile phones and calls. So again, to me, the reason why we need to look to the dark side is to identify how to minimize the government's ability to profit from it. And there are just too many Western firms that make it possible, right? And there are ways in which we can minimize, the kind of information and the amount of information that the governments can collect.
Thanks. And did you have data on how many followers there were on those 60 bloggers?
It's data that came from Al Jazeera, so I don't even know if they disclosed. I mean, it would be silly for Al Jazeera to disclose who those people were, in part because the government can then go and arrest them. But no, I take your point. I mean, it doesn't matter how many people you have on the ground because they can amplify because of the network effects and whatnot. But again, the narrative that you saw, the reason why I quote this stat in the book is because the narrative you saw in the Western media made it seem as if every second Iranian had a mobile phone from which they were tweeting. Right? It was not that Twitter didn't play some role. Of course it played some role in publicizing what was happening. But the dominant narrative in the Western media was that, hey, all of the Iranians organized online, they all read it on Twitter, and each of them was tweeting from the square. And that's not what was happening.